This is Game Changers, a quarterly series delivering expertise and inspiration to elevate your game for good. In today's live stream, unlock artificial intelligence with experts from Notre Dame, IBM, and Google. Game Changers, Decoding AI, is powered by Irish Compass, the official professional network of Notre Dame alumni. Welcome to Game Changers.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Game Changers series and the Decoding AI panel session this evening, brought to you by the University of Notre Dame Alumni Association. I'm really excited to have you join us for tonight, which I think will be an exciting night discussing a very important and pervasive topic, artificial intelligence. I'm very happy to report that we've assembled just an amazing team tonight representing viewpoints of the University of Notre Dame and major corporations such as IBM, as well as some of the thought leaders in government and across academia. Let me introduce tonight's panel. First, I'm happy to report that we're joined by Notre Chavla, Funding Director of the Lucy Family Institute for Data Society and the Frank M. Fryman Professor of Computer Science and Engineering. Nick Fearing, Vice President and Controller for IBM, my second favorite member of the class of 01 behind my own spouse. Tom Kenny, class of 05, National Security Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School. And finally, Young-Shuk Lee, Program Chair in Technology Ethics and Associate Professor of Technology, Economy, and Global Affairs at the Keough School of Global Affairs here at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being here tonight for what I'm sure is going to be an exciting discussion. I want to, before going further and diving into the questions tonight, I also want to remind the audience that you have a chance to participate. And so please make sure that you put your questions into the comments as we proceed this evening. And near the end of tonight's program, we'll be sure to take some of those questions so that you can be part of the discussion. With that, let's dive into our packed program. So let's start with something pretty basic. There's a lot of confusion out there in today's world about generative AI, large language models, machine learning, and traditional AI. Some of it leads to excitement, some of it leads to fear, a lot of it leads to uncertainty. Nitesh, could you maybe give us a quick tutorial of generative AI in layperson's terms so that we might all be kind of level set and get on the same page to start this evening?
Sure thing, Jeff. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Jeff, for moderating us, and delighted to be on this panel with everyone. And again, thank you to Think Andy and Alumni Association for hosting us together. So, let's start with artificial intelligence, right? So, the term AI is sort of, if you think about it, is if I'm given some certain amounts of data, certain kinds of data, could I develop computer algorithms or software to learn from the data so I can infer or predict or describe or discover some underlying phenomena that may be resident in that data? It's no different than, we sort of, read as humans from our books and we assimilate certain concepts and then we check our learning based on an exam or a quiz that we take. And then based on the exam or a quiz, we say, oh, this is how well you did. You get an A or a B or a C. And imagine the same kind of power being given to a computer software or computer algorithm. So that sort of is how I would look at that. Now, generative AI brings the word generative sort of brings in a very probabilistic viewpoint to it, which there's no determinism. So when, say, for example, if we are interacting with a chat GPT or a llama or any other large language model that may be available, so they have sort of, if you think about a large language model, the universe of the publicly available data, or in some cases, non-publicly available data, represented in, imagine there's a vast memory bank of billion, trillion parameters, represented that as in the encoding space. So now when I ask a question of a large language model, for example, of ChatGPT, or choose your favorite one, Gemini, or the AWS one. So you basically, once you ask the question, it takes the words, it puts them in that embedding space and projects them into the memory and say, okay, this is the closest word I could find. And then probabilistically, it starts picking up what is the best next word to come after. What is the best next pixel to come after? What's the best next audio to come after? And hence it's generative AI because it's probabilistically first taking what you're asking, projecting it into a space, and then finishing it again probabilistically by saying this or this, this or this, this or this. And hence, when we talk to these language models or when we chat with these language models, we're not guaranteed to have the same answers. It's not like I'm asking a SQL query to a database that says will always give me the exact answer. With these generative AI systems, it's done. So that's where it's the creativity that we seem to have appreciated, the ability to create art, music, text, essays, is very reckoning because it says these are the best things that people have seen. These are the best poems or art based on what you're asking me to do. Let me build something based on everything else that I've seen in the past.
Great. Thank you, Nitesh. Maybe I'll just ask you, get a rare chance here for our alums to follow up on our professors. So, Nick, anything that you might add to the definition from an industry perspective?
I'm glad you asked Nitesh that question first. I'm always going to answer that in a couple of minutes. Look, I would just add, maybe from like a business perspective, we all know AI is having a moment right now. And, I think to kind of like build off what Nitesh said, why is that? And I think there's two primary reasons. One is really self-evident. And, we know with ChatGPT at the end of 2022, beginning of last year, really brought to the foreground and made accessible for the first time these large language models, these foundation models, and brought it out of the purview of, the domain expert, the researcher, the Nitesh's and Young's of the world, and brought it to the foreground for all of us to utilize. And that is really clear. The second, though, which I think is a little bit more nuanced, when you sort of think about the way Nitesh described it, for the first time with an AI technology, these large language models or these large foundation models are able to solve economically a broad set of very specific use cases across a wide spectrum of business application. And we didn't have that before, right? I mean, AI has been around for a long time, in various forms. You can go back to like the late 90s, as an example with IBM with Deep Blue, famously beat Kasparov in chess. And those are kind of like beginning early days of AI. And we achieved that through real just straight brute force, right? We threw compute at it. We threw, a ton of developers. We threw a lot of scientists, and we solved a very narrow problem playing the game of chess. The problem with that was we then said, well, go solve this business problem over here, or go solve this consumer facing issue over here. What you found is that there's very little of that was applicable. You kind of had to start over and throw a whole bunch more resources, a whole bunch more investment at it. And that just doesn't work. It takes too much time, takes too much investment. So for the first time, we've got these large language models, these huge foundation models that cost a lot to build. But once you have that, it's relatively minor amount of new skilling or tuning or training that's required to now go apply it across a wide spectrum of use cases. So the aperture of accessibility to the user community and the aperture of accessibility to new use cases, to a broad application of use cases, is really what I think is differentiating this moment in time.
So Nick, not to just follow up with that, if I can put you on the spot, with that kind of take of the current state, maybe what's happening globally, can you give us just a snippet of maybe something exciting where IBM's at this current time in this space, and what's exciting you that you could talk about publicly?
Yeah, sure. So all that said, right, I think we are, so IBM is business to business, right? All of our clients are other businesses. So we deal predominantly within like large enterprise space. So that's sort of the perspective that I bring to this. And, we are very early days, right? I think, we talk to our clients, we see out there something like 70% of initial pilots or projects are not scaling, right? They're being left on the cutting room floor. So R&D, and probably more on the R side than even D. But, and we can get into the reasons why. I think there are several. Maybe we'll unpack that as we go through the conversation this evening. But in terms of use cases, I think there's three general areas where we see early traction with ourselves and clearly with our clients as well. The first and probably most aware that we all see is customer service, right? So think about this as like the dreaded pick up the phone, call the help center, or you're buying something online and you've got questions with a chatbot. In most cases at this point, you're dealing with AI, or you might be lucky enough to deal with a human, but that human's got a dashboard and they're being augmented with AI insight about your situation and hopefully being empowered to help fix it. It may not feel this way, but some of those bots are actually getting quite good. And it's really, really come along from the old days of punching through, different selections on your keypad and trying to get to a human. So that's one category. The second is the world where I live in finance within IBM. Think of like digital workers. So the back offices of all of these large enterprises, accounting, finance, procurement, legal, HR, so on and so forth. There are many, many workflows that exist within enterprises that can be digitized, can be automated, and then leveraged with AI. And in this space, we see anywhere from 30 to 40% of productivity to be unlocked. Definitely within the finance space, within the accounting space, contract review, there's a lot of opportunity. And then I think from an IBM perspective, the last category here, and probably one of the most exciting, is in coding. So we all think large language models. We think, human languages, English, Mandarin, Spanish, French. These models, though, it turns out, are actually exceptionally good at coding languages. And there are a lot of coding languages out there. Some are very old and fairly arcane, and there's not a lot of developer skills left to support. Think like COBOL, which is the backbone of the mainframe and the transactional, banking and ticketing world. What we find is that these models can help enormously with translation, with interpretation of what that code is doing, and with even just straight writing code. So there's a ton of productivity that can be brought to bear for the developer community, which we're seeing a lot start to roll out and deploy within the company and also certainly within the clients that we work with.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Let's keep our panelists on their toes tonight. Yong, I might kick it to you for a second. Maybe you could give us a sense of the state of generative AI as it relates to the campus community and academia writ large before we dig into some specifics of your expertise later on in tonight's hour.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm an economist by training, so I try to use these models in my research as well, but think about, the implications for workers. So if you think about the campus situation, I think one of the things that often comes up is access to state-of-the-art generative AI models. There are differences in capabilities, and we wonder if you think about the labor market, like IBM, consulting firms, they're all full speed ahead of adopting this technology and trying to implement that into their workflow. Whereas in the university space, we're very cautious about how we actually should adopt generative AI or into our courses. And this creates sort of a tension that I see among our students, where students become a bit concerned and worried. And I've actually talked with a few folks. I was at the AI Alliance meeting with Meta and IBM, and they were talking about how Gen Zers are actually quite scared of AI. And in some sense, we're not doing a great job in alleviating their fear, and this is actually spilling over to the labor market. Whereas the Gen Alphas, sort of the teens, the tweens, they're not concerned or worried about this. This is sort of a new tool. They're exploring, experimenting with this. So I think as an educational institution, we have to sort of grapple with this tension, how the pace of innovation that's happening, that is so rapid, and sort of the stickiness and the carefulness of an educational institution.
That's great, Yong. So, Tom, let's bring you into the conversation as well. Yong just referred to some of the challenges we face here in academia as it relates to generative AI. Of course, there's other things, tremendous costs, the need to upskill the workforce, corporate governance, national governance in some cases, or international governance. Could you share a little bit about how you think about some of these challenges and how to overcome them?
The challenges in many ways are rooted into where we've come with generative AI today, which a lot of folks are looking at this tool as the hammer, and every problem they have is the nail. It's like generative AI can solve everything. But there's a real nuance here, which a lot of folks are not yet understanding, whether it's academia, whether it's government, or whether it's corporations, which is what really is generative AI. And we've talked a little bit about this and what it can do. And the probabilistic outcome of how one thing leads to another is really what we're talking about, is what is the most likely thing to happen, whether that's a word or that's a phrase or that's a pixel from an image. And it's interesting because you think about companies like Google and where we looked when I was at Google years ago and thinking about how we're actually doing translation. Translation was one of those things that computer scientists for years got together with a whole bunch of linguists for years, and they tried to teach a machine all of these different rules, right? Even in the early days of game systems, we would try to teach the computer what the rules are and then teach it how to use those rules to its advantage and what the moves are and what a win is like. Well, one of the biggest breakthroughs came in 2016, where we started using things called neural machine translation. Right? This is something that Google started when they threw out this idea of all these computer scientists were the linguists. And they said, we're not going to teach the computer all of these rules. We're going to teach the computer how to read. And basically what came out of this is the ability to read one text. And for a lot of our standard texts, we've got hundreds of languages that we've translated this into. And so if you think about generative AI and you ask it a question, it's thinking about the probabilistic outcome of what word follows the next word, what phrase follows the next phrase. What's the most opportunistic word phrase that I can give you as a response? And that just exploded the ability for translation. And you think about where we are with governments, and you think about with academia, they in particular are struggling a bit with this great big new tool that, to your point, is very expensive. It is sometimes difficult to use. But the real interesting part is it's deceptively simple to use. And I'd like to call one thing out when you think about academia and you think about governments, in particular with the US Department of Defense. I sit on the Defense Science Board, and I'm on the Generative AI Task Force right now. And we're supposed to be helping the Secretary of Defense understand what he needs to think about for generative AI in the next 5 to 7 years. And there's a lot of things that we can talk about with technology and scale computing and how much nuclear power are we going to need to fuel all these data centers and where's our security for our chipsets. But there's another even more important aspect to this that we touched a little bit on, which is the talent pool. You know, software coding, you know, to what Nick said, it is fantastic. I mean, it is scary fantastic. Both of my daughters are computer science grads, and I'm warning them about what the future is going to be like for them, for how easy this is. You think about Google Colab, for example. It's a Jupyter notebook, which is a programming technique where you can build small blocks of code and then execute those blocks individually. And it was a great start a number of years ago for building these systems. But now what you can do is actually write in some text and say, I would like a Python library to be able to determine whether or not my company is going to be able to win in this product market, and here's some of my data. And it will take that text and it can write the entire Python for you right off the bat. And you can take those same types of systems to Nick's point, all of the antiquated banking systems, all the antiquated government systems that are written in COBOL or written in old versions of C or are written on systems that still use floppy disks, because we still have systems in the US government that use floppy disks that haven't been upgraded. Using generative AI in these kind of targeted capabilities, couple that with the AI talent management, and that's what's really going to get us past where we are today, which is everything's a hammer and a nail, and get to a point where we can do very specific and very targeted capability development that doesn't cost an arm and a leg or an entire national budget. That is what's really going to help us accelerate where we can go with generative AI in the future.
Thank you, Tom. You know, Nitesh, one of the joys of my job as Vice President for Research is I get to discuss hard challenges like this with faculty. You and I have had a conversation about overcoming the challenges of AI over an adult beverage on occasion. We don't have one tonight yet, but maybe you can opine a little bit about how the university is tackling some of these challenges that Tom talked about, which are certainly universal.
I agree. So I think so. There was several challenges, right? First of all, from a computer science curriculum perspective as well, and I agree with Nick and Tom what you both have expressed about especially from a coding perspective, software perspective. But as I reflect as well within the university curriculum at Notre Dame and others, we are still figuring it out, but we have embraced tools alongside as we have calculators or Excel sheets or Grammarly's and spell checks, and so these were all made things better and easier. It allowed us to focus on, hey, what kind of paper I may write, and focusing on the content, etc. Then syntactically we may not be as good as we were when I was a student. We had to write on pen and paper. You make a mistake, right? And that's how the paper gets turned in, right? You couldn't even erase it. So so as we think about collabs and co-pilots and then other tools that are coming into the world with these coding platforms, how do we make our students focusing on questions to ask, things to think about, conjuring up higher order concepts? And personally, I feel Notre Dame is uniquely positioned because of our assertion on the more holistic education. We create thinkers out of Notre Dame, right? So how do we sort of begin to think and ask of these questions and then everything else is a tool, like everything else was, right? Right from Industrial Revolution. So we are still figuring it out, but I'm optimistic that, how do we sort of create a space for additional efforts, creativities? Maybe there'll be more companies that will be created. Maybe there'll be more entrepreneurship opportunities that would happen. When I came to the US in '97, toll booths used to have humans collecting money. Those went away, right? Grocery shops used to always have individuals collecting, but those are going away. But that doesn't mean the unemployment rates have gone skyrocketed, right? So there's a replacement effect. Second thing, on the research side, one of the things that I heard was cost and Tom, as you said, the national budget, right? And the billions of dollars that are invested into these things. I think that's beautiful from an academic perspective. We can invest that money. So then it forces us to think about, my mantra nowadays is, how can we do more with less? We will have less compute, less data than any, whether defense or corporation. So how can we be on that next edge of innovation? Could we now figure out less power hungry chips? Could we figure out algorithms that work differently? Could we figure out a large language model parameter space that doesn't need a billion trillion parameters? Or could we figure out, as folks have said on this panel already, building up these specialized models where the training has been done, whether within the IBM large language model or Google or etc., and then we bring in specialized knowledge to customize, fine-tune them for a specific application, which brings in that domain expertise that we as academics can bring to fore. So and then we have to also think about bias and ethics and as well as integrity of these models. There are some really thorny questions as academics to ask, and I couldn't be more excited because these are thorny, wicked questions to ask.
That's a great segue, Nitesh, to the next question I wanted to ask you all. One of the things that I think is unique about Notre Dame, or unique amongst Notre Dame and its peers, is that we like to think deeply about some of the hard challenges that face society. And a lot of those around this topic of AI is centered around the ethics of AI and its use. So let's take a deep dive on that with this awesome panel. And maybe, Young, maybe I could start with you. I'm curious about AI and workers. Nitesh just alluded to this a little bit, but how do you think AI will affect the future of work in this nation and across the globe? And do you think, are you a pessimist or an optimist about this? And how do you think the nature of work's going to change?
Okay, so whether I'm a pessimist or optimist, I'll defer that to a bit later. But I think there's several angles to this question, and there's both optimistic and sort of pessimistic views because they're happening at the same time. One is as an economist, we care a lot about labor productivity. Are new technologies making workers more productive? How is that affecting different workers? Inequality, for instance. And there's been evidence where there's experiments that economists have done where they give access to sort of state-of-the-art models, ChatGPT, and find productivity increases in various sectors, and it sort of actually benefits workers with lower capabilities. And in some sense, it feels like, oh, there's a leveling effect of capabilities by giving access to these models, and that's very promising. But another key issue is who has access to these models, who gets access, right? Even within university, the big debate is, okay, there's free models, there's state-of-the-art models. These models cost money. It seems like they're going to cost even more. How do we think about the inequality of access of models in terms of upskilling and training? And we talked about how productive this could be in terms of the workforce, but if it's not equally distributed, that becomes a fundamental issue. And frankly, I think there is evidence. I've been looking into some recent evidence. One of the key challenges is understanding the impact of especially AI, generative AI in the workforces. It's so new, data is very scarce. Economic data often takes a while. So, but I've been trying to look into these monthly economics data that the Bureau of Labor Statistics comes out, and I definitely do see this differential labor impact, even within computing, for instance, software developers compared to architectures or other folks. The relative unemployment, it has been increasing. If you think about operations versus managers, you can think that operations can be more readily replaced by AI. There is evidence that operations relative to managerial positions are suffering a bit more. So when we think about these differential effects, but nonetheless productivity benefits that could arise, how do we sort of put this all together to make sure that we try to make sure everyone is on board in terms of taking advantage and learning from this new technology?
Super helpful, Young. Thank you. Nick, maybe let me kick it to you to ask a parallel ethics question. One of the positions that I know you enjoy there at IBM, apart from being a vice president and controller, is sitting on the steering committee of the IBM Notre Dame Tech Ethics Center. Can you talk a little bit about what that center is doing and maybe a little bit of how that is addressing some of the questions in this area too?
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. And maybe before I jump into it, I just want to connect a couple dots from that I think the panelists have shared here that I think is really on point, particularly on like the labor front and the workforce front. You as you expressed the concerns around really where is AI going to take the workforce? Where is AI going to take my job? And Tom, I think you hit it spot on that, and I don't think it's fully appreciated yet, that the importance of the domain role, the domain skill here, which really is kind of stepping up to bat and on par with the technologists in terms of deploying this capability. The way, the phrase that I've heard that I think is really on point is that, the role of the lawyer is not going away, but the lawyer that uses AI is going to replace the lawyer that doesn't. And I think that's a really, really important aspect to kind of take to heart. And as you're thinking about, I'm in a domain, I'm not a technologist, right? I'm in finance, right? But the role and the transformation of the finance organization, an accounting organization to take in these digital capabilities, AI capabilities is tantamount, right? And, this is going to play out. This is going to play out across jobs, broad base. But, as you touched on, really important here is, will this be democratized or is it going to be concentrated? And in particular, I think it's very important that we focus on those portions of our community, those portions of society that are generally underserved and that are more vulnerable to be left behind as technology, brings forward innovation and human ingenuity. And so that is very much central to IBM's view about, how we approach and our kind of value system. And so kind of tying that in to the role that I'm blessed to be able to play, being associated both with the university, an institution that I know and love, as well as IBM for the past 23 plus years, our two companies very much have a shared value system, a shared grounding in, a pursuit of common good. We've done a lot of collaborations over the years, and at the heart of it is the technology ethics lab that we launched back in 2020. Prior to all of this sort of fanfare and focus around ChatGPT. And what we're focused on in the lab is applied research, education and curriculum development. So reaching out to the communities both within the university, but also beyond to help support the more vulnerable. And in addition to advocate for policy and appropriate regulation from governments in order to ensure the responsible deployment of AI, which is, I think, a topic that we should touch on here. We're very blessed. The lab plays a cornerstone role. I would just give it a shout out to everyone listening to the call here. We want broader participation and collaboration in the lab from academia, but also very importantly as well from other participants within industry, whether it's technology industry or out into the domains as well.
Thank you, Nick. Tom, I think you have a unique viewpoint, perhaps amongst panelists, as someone that has your foot in a few different camps, academia, private sector, public sector, etc. Could you maybe comment a little bit on how you think those sectors can, are, and need to work together to be able to tackle, as what Nitesh described, these wicked hard challenges that have ethical and technical aspects amongst many others, financial, etc.?
So I appreciate the question, especially because of the intersection of academics, government and defense, and business, right? And as we think about this with ethics, one of the biggest challenges, if I look at the Department of Defense, the US government side of things, as ethics, I have to ask the question, whose ethics? This is a really, really difficult question to answer across the board, because we have adversaries that are using data and are using information in very different ways than we in the United States are using. A perfect example of this is thinking about when ChatGPT was trained with billions of hyperparameters and the information that it had available to it. There were adversaries that were training at near trillion numbers of hyperparameters. And the number of hyperparameters does have a direct impact on the quality of your model. The more data you have, the better you can actually predict. And if you think about some of the constraints that academia and the government have in the US, some of our adversaries do not. Information about where you've gone, who you talk to, videos from you walking on the street, all of your texts, all of your emails, which are visible by a state that has access to all that information, our adversaries, as opposed to where we are. So there's a fundamental strategic competition challenge with AI, just with the access to data, and the size of the data that we're looking at is available with some of our strategic competitors than we have internally. So that's a little bit of a part of the DoD challenge in thinking about the ethics. We have the ethics that we've construed with the Chief Digital and AI Officer in the Department of Defense. The Department of State has done the same type of thing, the Department of Health and Human Services. All of us in the government are trying to put out these responsible AI, ethical AI guidelines for how we're going to use the data. We're not going to use it against people. But what's really, really interesting is if you then take sort of that approach that says the government's not going to do anything nefarious towards population, and then you look at them, I'm going to do a little bit of a plug for a book that I absolutely love that was written by Cathy O'Neill, and it's called Weapons of Math Destruction. And it talks about how businesses in the United States are using more and more algorithmic capabilities that are creating even greater divides between the haves and the have-nots. If you think about very simple things like getting car insurance, if you think about rental properties, if you think about mortgages, there are so many examples of how artificially intelligent agents are actually working against what many of us at Notre Dame might say are against what we want for an equal society, where ethics are applied equally, responsibility is applied equally across the board. And there's, even in the news today, there's a very, very prominent story about in algorithms being used by people that are renting apartments and how those are artificially increasing the cost of rent, which is making massive impacts in cities around the US, where in Boston, it is incredibly difficult for people to be able to get into a home. In Dublin, Ireland, they're having trouble with first-time home buyers because some of those algorithms are pushing out those first-time home buyers in favor of the cash folks that have money from foreign governments that are just pouring money into these organizations. Tampa, Florida dealt with this a few years ago with the big influx of money that was coming in that was pushing people out of these capabilities. So as I think about where we are with government, some of the things that we need to do in business to kind of reel this in, this ties into where I think academia can really add some value. When you think about just simple things like the Peace Institute at Notre Dame that looks globally across how do we create these environments of more equality, which can lead to less violence, it can lead to less war, it can lead to more peace across. And the Tech Ethics Lab at Notre Dame is really well positioned to be able to do that. That thought leadership that says, here is how governments and here's how businesses should be thinking about ethical AI, and the application of it is really important. But I'll make one other point that I think is interesting from a technical standpoint that I feel very passionate about. And it's an area of focus for me in research here at the Harvard Kennedy School, which is the intersection of explainable AI and responsible AI. And this is a big challenge. The challenge here is when we think about the responsible side of things are usually the qualifiable aspects of responsibility. Here's what we should be doing. The explainable part of AI is too often looked at also as a qualitative that says, well, a human should be able to explain what this algorithm is doing. And in my mind, I think back to when I was the chief data officer and head of AI for Special Operations Command in Tampa, I used this explanation and said, following that kind of mantra is just like sending off a SEAL team. And when the SEAL team comes back and something goes wrong, you don't ask the SEAL team what they did or why they did it to try to understand what happened. You fly to Coronado, California, and you ask the SEAL team instructors, why did you teach the SEAL team to do this? It's not a great way to understand why something happened. We need to move the explainable part of AI to a quantitative metric, because this needs to lead to something down the road, which I also think academia can really help us figure out, which is how do we have the machines explain to us why they're making these decisions? Don't ask a human or an engineer. Have the machine tell us, have the agent explain what they're doing. Because when we move into the next generation of generative AI systems, we're going to be talking about agentic intelligence, where we have multiple agents working together to be able to have a system that can do multiple things. We don't have one algorithm in our brain. We have an algorithm for our eyes, for our nose, for our mouth, for our ears, for our muscle movements. Future systems are going to be acting exactly that way. And like our bodies do, where our eyes and our ears and our mouth can work together, that's how our new systems need to be able to work. So having that quantitative aspect of explainable AI and couple that with responsible AI, that's what's really going to get us to a true ethical application of AI systems.
Thank you, Tom. It's really insightful. Nitesh, I want to be respectful of time. We could spend a whole hour talking about how Notre Dame's trying to engage industry and the government to think about these wicked hard problems in AI. But Young brought up the AI Alliance. I know we're very involved in the NIST AI Safety Council. Maybe could you just take a minute or two, Nitesh, and just give a couple examples of how we're trying to work across boundaries here on campus to tackle some of the wicked hard challenges beyond what we've heard about already?
Absolutely. I think there's a couple of things, right? I do, for example, a lot of the work at the Lucy Family Institute, we think about, responsible AI, and then as well as inclusive AI. By inclusive AI, what I mean is, are the voices of the underrepresented, the data, adequately represented even in the algorithms that we are developing, right? So responsibility is a wide spectrum. Developers of the algorithm, users of the algorithm, and if we achieve the AGI space, the algorithms themselves, everyone has a shared responsibility, right? But at the same time, is the data, do we have, we think a lot about the global south, how are they represented, the data, the voices, do they have a seat on the table in this development, etc. I think it's a whole spectrum, and I do like the intersection of explainability, inclusivity, and responsibility, so to speak. Now, on the NIST AI safety side, so we've been involved in a task force on AI safety, which I've been participating for the last few weeks with NIST, and we're deeply thinking about there's a wide spectrum of individuals on that from different organizations and the dual use technologies, right? We have seen that with gene editing, we have seen that with deep learning and deep fakes and things like, and the social media. What is the dual use risk within chemical or biological systems with these AI, right? And then how do we sort of address those? And I think that's very nicely connected with the Young was mentioning the AI alliance that IBM and Meta took leadership. That in saying we can only get better if we sort of have an open dialogue among industry and academia and together, right? Where it's not, I don't even consider it necessarily that it's open source code first. We have seen the amazing things that Linux did back in the day. But it's more about understanding we can create better standards, we can have a better sense of safety, we can have a better sense of, where the challenges are, and collectively address them, because the industry may see those sooner than academia because of, as Nick even mentioned, the wide use cases the industry is deploying these on. So I feel those two kinds of initiatives where being able to get together and ask these questions about use, and then thinking about what can we do from a fundamental scholarship or research question becomes very important. And again, I applaud NIST and I applaud IBM to say, hey, we're going to do this. We're going to bring people together.
Hey Jeff, can I just jump in for a quick minute? So I think we would all agree that the government has a really important role to play here and needs to step into the fray. And we're seeing it in some places. The EU, which is typically at the forefront with the AI Act, is very much spot on. And we're touching on a bunch of points here. I think there are three real fundamentals in how we need to bring regulation to bear for responsible deployment of AI. The first is we've got to regulate at the use case, right, where the risk intercepts with society, where the models are intercepting with society. That's exactly what the EU AI Act does. It goes from prohibitively high use cases that are expressly prohibited, think like predictive policing and social profiling and the like, down to things like that are very low risk, like spam filters on your email and the like, and puts different levels of guardrails and regulations around that. Two, we need to support and be proponents of, and I think very much from an industry perspective, but also government, of an open approach, an open innovation approach to how we develop and nurture AI, much along the lines of the AI Alliance and Nitesh, what you just described. There's two reasons for that. One is we need to democratize the value that comes from the AI versus licensing and concentrating it with a select few. But second, as the old adage goes, sunlight is the best antiseptic. And the more eyes, the more developers, the more people working on these models and the use of the models, the better off we all will be. And the third, and I think this is I think it's shared amongst the panel here probably, but it's a pretty maybe controversial point within the technology industry, is that the creators and deployers of the models need to be held accountable. And I think this is very, very key. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Section 203 as it pertains to social media platforms and the challenges that we're faced with, particularly with our youth in that regard. If you don't hold the creators of the models accountable and liably accountable, then we're going to be in a very difficult situation. That's certainly how IBM's approached it. Even before the regulation is in place, we indemnify our models as it is today, meaning we stand between the clients that utilize our Granite models and someone that might come at them from a copyright perspective or from IP standpoint. That puts us in a position of kind of raising the bar of accountability and has us approach development of our models in deployment of our models in a way that, kind of forces us to be at that higher standard. That's critical from an industry standpoint.
Tom, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I just want to add one other thing as we think about this growth. We talk about how we make these accessible, how do we make them accessible in a responsible way. There's another side to this that I think is important for people to understand. We have a lot of research that talks about how resumes are written differently between genders, differently between socioeconomic statuses. We have a lot of folks who don't speak English as their native language. And one of the things as we think about the openness of these languages and the accessibility of these languages, especially with the impact it's going to have on the workforce of the future, to the responsibility comment of Nick, we as providers of these technologies need to recognize that there is going to initially be, if we continue down this path, there's going to initially be a disparity between people who can do prompt engineering really well because they speak and they talk and they walk just like the duck that LLM expects them to, and people who do not. And I had a really fantastic conversation with a researcher who worked on that initial AI document with the EU, who's here at the Kennedy School, and we chatted about what does this mean if we don't take this into account for who is actually using these tools and ensuring that we have accessibility built into these tools so that different genders, different socioeconomic statuses, different cultures all are on the same level playing field. We're going to introduce even more of a disparity between who can actually use these for the future.
Great, Tom. Okay, to finish my questions for the night, before we turn to the audience, I want to end on a positive note. And so, in the respect for time, I'm going to ask each of you to keep your remarks brief. I'd love for you to give me just a few examples where you're convinced in the next couple of years we'll see AI actually enhancing the common good. Let me start with you.
Yeah. So I'll go back to AI ethics in this regard. So it's a bit of more high level, but it's just an initiative that I find it's unique at Notre Dame. Is when we think about AI ethics, I think brought up a lot of good points, especially from the technological point, but also just thinking about, okay, what the human interaction with AI should look like. What should humans, virtuous human be look like in an era of AI? Those type of questions are being asked at this campus. Fusion of humanities, technologists, social sciences. And by asking these questions, I think that gives us hope that, okay, we'll be able to develop students, researchers that seriously think about the consequences of technology, but also nurture, humans that can ethically make decisions in an era of just rapid technological progress. So that's one big high-level hope.
Nitesh, let's get you next.
So I think one example I would share is some of the work that we have been doing with healthcare partners spread across Latin America, Jeff. A lot of these healthcare facilities are still sitting with paper-based records, don't have digitization and things like that. Now with the advances that we have seen, we heard about translation, we heard about transcription today and all the tools and taking all the unstructured data and structuring it together. Could we sort of empower these healthcare facilities in the global south and sort of think about what can be a digitized versions of their historic data? Could they be used for risk assessment triaging? Could we bring in the social determinants data to truly inform what could be some of the treatment or diagnosis pathways for these physicians? Because today, when a patient arrives, they have to go to the basement, pick up the paper-based file and sort of look through it, right? So, and we are seeing some amazing impact of this work for the last several years that we've been working with our partners in Latin America. It's been beautiful, right? And that truly is advancing common good and sort of, it's sort of within the mission of a university. We talk about we want to be the global Catholic university, distinct or at par with some of the best private universities in the world. So amazing research, thinking about the underserved, vulnerable, making a difference, adhering to a Catholic mission, and producing scholarship that's second to none.
Thank you, Nitesh. Tom, what creates optimism for you amongst where we're heading?
I tell you, when I look back on history, I think some of the greatest advances we've ever had have been when we've leveraged technology to augment what we're doing as humans. I think that's really where the biggest win is. We can talk about disrupting workforces, we can talk about disrupting economies, and many workforces and many economies have been disrupted and been disrupted for good. There's nobody left who wants to go, in the fields of cotton or in the fields of pineapple or in the sugarcane fields and do this all manually like we were doing hundreds of years ago. And so when I think about that augmentation, I don't think about technology like generative AI replacing a doctor or a scientist or a researcher in the medical field, for example. And this is where I get most excited. I think about what Google DeepMind is doing with a tool that they've got now called Alpha Proteo. And when we were developing the concept behind this, it was about how do we train systems to be able to do what researchers might take years or decades to research and really compress that. And with Alpha Proteo, it's really thinking about how do we identify how proteins are targeted. And how proteins are targeted is a really big part of understanding cancer treatments. So if we can do 100 years of 100 brilliant minds of research in the period of 2 or 3 years, by augmenting what the researchers are already doing, imagine the amazing potential that we're going to have as a society to eradicate some of these diseases and some of these maladies that we've had as humans for almost the entirety of our existence, to be able to do it with its augmentation of this amazing technology.
And Nick, let's close with you. What's the optimism for you?
I'm going to go down a similar thread to where Tom went. Like every technology cycle before it, AI will be inherently human-centric, right? And when I talk to my teams who are, and fairly so, have concerns and worries about substantial portions of their job today being automated and being taken away from them, the discussion we have is really about the notion of taking the robot out of the human, right? Technology is productivity, which frees humans up to do what humans do best. Use our own ingenuity to innovate. Now, that I feel very strongly about. All that said, I think it can also be true that technology could be misapplied and not, oriented towards the greater good, that it can be unevenly distributed. And I think where I'd land then is really a call to action from the panel here is definitely all in. But I think for a lot of the listeners that are dialing in on a Wednesday night, taking their time to listen to this, we are all of a common shared purpose, shared value system grounded in a pursuit of a common good. We need to participate in this next phase of technological evolution. We need to step up to the plate and ensure that for ourselves and for the companies that we work with and the governments that we operate within, that we're ethically deploying AI. We need to ensure that we're educating the next generations with particular attention on those that are more vulnerable and underserved today. And I think very importantly, we need to be advocating with our governments, both locally and at the federal level, to ensure that they are stepping up to the plate to put in place the right guardrails to ensure the ethical deployment, the responsible deployment of AI. If we can do that, if we step to the plate as a community and lead the way here, the opportunity and the potential here is really unbounded.
All right. Thank you, panel. You survived the easy part of the evening. Those were the questions created by myself and the team here at the Alumni Association. Now comes the hard part, the candid questions from the audience. I might ask panelists, just so we can get through as many questions in the time we have allotted today, I might just ask one or two of you to respond to each of these so we can try to go through as many questions. So Tom, I'm going to start with you, and forgive me, audience, I might make a little bit of moderator edits on the fly here to morph the conversation, but Tom, let me start with you. Sarah Buds had the question, and you alluded to earlier, power consumption associated with AI. Could you comment, should we be concerned about the environmental impacts of the use of AI?
We absolutely should. As we think about the size and capacity of the future AI data centers, there can be a lot we can do more with less, to use that quote from earlier. But the real challenge is going to be the more with less will only come over time, and there's going to be a near-term need. So I do think that's important. But I will say that there are a lot of companies out there. Google is one of the leaders in this space of thinking about how do we do this more environmentally friendly, or at least as environmentally friendly as we can. And there are some simple ways to think about that. How can we move data centers to much cooler climates? How can we run our data centers at much higher temperatures than maybe we have in the past? I remember, building my first SaaS data center back in the 90s. It was frigid cold every single time you were in there. But you go into some of the data centers we have today, and it's nice and warm and balmy because we can run them at higher temperatures. We have water cooling, different things like that. And I think some of the newer technologies that are coming out, there's a company called TMP Core, which is building single and dual phase immersion technology, where you can run the computerized systems in liquid. And that significantly decreases the amount of HVAC capacity you have, because those are really the two aspects of it. The one, the power that has to run the chips, but two, the power that actually provides the HVAC to keep all of these systems in a temperate way so that they can operate at maximum efficiency. And there's not an either or. It's not like we can't have AI and we can have a good climate. We can actually do these two things together if we think intelligently about it.
Thank you, Tom. We're all here tonight because we're connected with the University of Notre Dame, and University of Notre Dame would be nothing without its students. So let's ask a student-centric question. And Yang, I might kick this to you. I think maybe just before I ask this, to set it up, those interested in how we're thinking about engaging our students in AI, we did have a task force earlier this year, and Nitesh, Yang, myself were on it. You can read some reports about how the university is thinking about this. But Yang, I might ask you, whether you stated with that report or broadly, could you maybe share for the audience how Notre Dame's embracing AI in its education of students, and how we're communicating with students, and how we're addressing the fact that the technology is changing so rapidly that educating students on that topic is a little difficult? And thank you, Karen, for the question.
Yeah, we do have these student task force. Each university, school, campus has their separate initiatives. Courses, we're trying to engage students to how to use generative AI. I think what's nice is there's multi-institute centers that are tackling this at the same time. So it's through, I think, multiple efforts of having students being involved in some of these research projects, having a lot of these workshops, discussions, and also actual concrete classes that center around embedding AI into the education.
Great, thank you. Nitesh, the next question is going to be from you. It's from Himanshu Gol, and it's certainly something that I know a lot of our colleagues on campus are thinking about currently. And that question is, since AI-generated output will eventually be fed back as input, at what point does creativity diminish? And what methods are being used to minimize or prevent this?
Thank you, Himanshu. It's a wonderful question, because what's going to happen is, right, we are generating data using the AI systems, and those data are going to be fed back into the systems that are sort of, relearning on them again. And what is generated and versus what is real, it will become a very diffuse concept. So within our labs, and we're really thinking hard about already, can we look at certain distributional divergences or understand what is the generated, or is there certain underlying parameters that govern the distribution or generation of new examples that don't belong to the original data, and as well as the original data that was sort of fed into the system to begin with. So this is a hard technical problem, right? That needs to be, because what could happen is we may perpetuate biases by doing this. We may perpetuate misinformation, could bleed into disinformation, fake things could bleed into the real things, and sort of we won't be able to distinct versus what was the correct classification versus the incorrect classification, so to speak. So these things have to be addressed. They have to be addressed now, and this is something that we are actively looking at within our research program at Notre Dame as well.
If I can just follow up with you, I'm curious. I appreciate your background as a computer scientist. I know you're a man of many interests, though. Can you maybe expound a little bit on how you see AI affecting things like the arts and humanities and where we're already seeing it, or architecture, which have, just pure aspects of creativity in them that are sometimes masked by AI, but certainly there's some compelling use cases as well.
Jeff, you direct to me or Nick?
To you, Natasha, if you don't mind to just explain.
No, of course. So I think so. To me, there's multiple. I think something that came up earlier in the discussion, I think Nick or Tom both were mentioning it, that specific use cases, right? So we are seeing certain things, and we are doing a lot of work within chemistry, NSF funded center on, domains that are sort of governed by physical laws, if you will, right? That you have to follow these laws to have that chemical reaction. You have to follow these things to have that, PD operate within physics-based models, etc. Now, when we think about human creativity with art, poem, music, etc., I mean, there is no bounds to it, right? There is no certain thing to say, okay, you must follow these, whether we are, when we are looking at art of some famous artists, whether it's surrealism or things like that, there are things that just how I feel, what I discovered, and how I'm expressing that moment in my time. So, in my opinion, this humanities would be shaken up a bit more initially than because of the ability to create essays, the ability to create write-ups, the ability to create art. And if you look at now text to image generation, text to video generation, it's very difficult to sometimes identify what was real versus what was fake anymore, right? And so it is going to be highly disruptive. If I could think of a concept in my head and interact with the Gen AI system and iterate with it and say, now show me it this way, show me it that way, I may find a beautiful sense of architecture or art or a parameter space of, including the measurements and things like that, that will make that building stand. So it would simply be and I'm curious, I don't know what a real answer is. That's why I'm waffling a bit, because what the end could be is that, what does it mean to those disciplines then? Where if I can be creative without studying the science behind it, but think about it, can the generative AI system help me work through the things that I don't know?
This is great. All right, Nick, I'm going to kick the next one to you. You described yourself earlier on this call as the finance guy. So let me ask you a question that I'm sure IBM's thinking about from Michael Siss. How does one deal with issues of copyright and plagiarism when using AI? And how is a company like IBM thinking about that from an intellectual property standpoint?
Yeah, so this is a very important question. I think one that sort of touches on part of the answer that Nitesh gave earlier. And I'd answer it two ways. One is it's very, very important that part of any governance structure that a company puts in place, this is governance. I think if you go around C-suites and you go around boardrooms today, probably the top topic around AI, and AI is in of itself a top topic, is, do we have the right risk management framework? Do we have the right governance that we're putting in place for the responsible deployment of our own use of AI within the company? And you can look at surveys of, the CFO community that I live in. You go back like a decade, and CFOs that we've surveyed will say that, yes, something like 2/3 of those CFOs say that their finance organizations are effectively managing risk. Today, when you ask that same question, it's something like only 1/3 of CFOs that are comfortable with that. And it's exactly because of this concern and issue. The way that we approach it, one, we actually have an AI ethics board that establishes policies for how we approach what data and in what fashion can that data be utilized. And we go through a fairly extensive process of where we're collecting from. Make no mistake about it, these large language models today, whether it's Google's Gemini models, IBM's Granite models, OpenAI's GPT, they've essentially sucked in all the data that sits within the public domain in the internet today, but filtered to responsible use. And so there is a lot that can be unpacked underneath that question. But what data and what fashion, data privacy, copyright protections, IP protections, as I mentioned before, our models, we feel very confident in how we put them together and what data we use to the point where we indemnify their use with our clients. What models can you use and how do you measure the performance of those models? How do you monitor and test and ensure that they're not creating hallucinations, that they're not introducing biases that you don't want? And then I end kind of on the most important point where we touched on before. What are the appropriate use cases to apply those models against? And then you take that whole governance framework that I would say within IBM, we've spent a lot of time focusing on for ourselves, but also with our clients, and you put it into soup of all the regulation that's starting to roll out around the world, and you hope it's all interoperable. It's unlikely that will be the case. Again, the AU Act is the first comprehensive framework. Today, it just so happens, IBM signed a pact to early adopt the deployment of the EU AI Act, which will roll out over the next 3 years here. But you really need then have a monitoring framework, a tooling capability framework to understand what the evolution of regulation is around the world and make sure that you can dynamically and naturally adjust your business model to respond appropriately. So this is, a very, very big topic and one that I think a lot of companies are putting attention on. But when we talk about like skills and capabilities within this space, it's a big gap right now that most larger enterprises are furiously working on closing.
That's great. All right, let's close tonight's discussion with some pragmatic advice for our audience. I'm going to give each of you about 2 minutes to answer this, and we'll do something that's a bit miraculous, but we'll end on time. So, Young, I'm going to start with you, and all of you are going to get the same questions from Victor Castillo. How would you suggest the audience attempts to start integrating and adopting the use of AI in their everyday life and work environment? Young, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think whatever one's occupation is, think of a key task that you need to perform, and just sit with one of these, very capable models and experiment with it. Ask it, prompt it, play around with it, and see its capabilities. And I'm sure many will be surprised of its capabilities and what it can actually do. And go to the next stage and think about, can you actually create a research assistant or an assistant that could help your workflow? So I think just experimenting with that at this stage will be very helpful.
Great, thank you, Young. Tom, how about you? Any thoughts on how people can start to integrate and adopt AI in their everyday lives?
I would say we already have AI in our everyday lives, but specifically for generative AI, I want to build on what Young was saying, which is don't just experiment and kind of play a little bit. Think about it like you were testing a system so that you can understand a little bit better how it responds. Try to ask a question and then in a very specific way, start a new thread with generative AI and ask the same question in a different way and watch how it responds slightly differently. And then start to understand how using prompt engineering in a very efficient way can get you closer to the answers you're looking for or to the support you need. And then while you're doing that, also keep a very close eye on it and start to learn to look for the concept of hallucination and know when the generative AI models are actually making stuff up. It's going to look so believable. You're going to use it and you're going to put it up on a slide and you're going to present it and someone's going to call you out on it. So be sure that you know how you can start recognizing where generative AI is actually lying to you, because it will happen. So doing those two things, understanding how to better prompt engineer, and then also getting a feel of how to detect hallucinations are two great ways to really start using it effectively.
Thank you, Tom. Nick, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I'll take it down a slightly different track in the interest of a little bit of diversity of thought here. From an organization perspective, like how I approach it, or as a leader of teams in an organization, we spend a lot of time within the finance community, within IBM, looking at our work activities, looking at the workflows and where our people spend our time. And what we find is that we still do have a lot of our day consumed by rote manual tasks. We've identified, some of the more acute pain points, contract review within the accounting organization, bringing in contracts that have been assigned, that have been recently signed, and reading through to understand the terms and conditions to ensure that we know how to record appropriately from an accounting standpoint. When you think through and identify workflows like that are fairly low from a judgment perspective, that are time consuming, rote task oriented, and you tackle that with we've initially tackled that with kind of a machine learning type approach, and then bring Gen AI to do contract scraping, pre-population of checklists, and go from a human doing the work to a human reviewing the results of the work. That opportunity to unlock productivity amongst ourselves as individuals and amongst our teams, then free us up to focus on high value business advisory, judgment, business decision making, is like a great unlocked potential. We apply that with the organizations we lead, but also apply that just in terms of your day in and day out job activities as well.
Thank you, Nick. Nitesh, I'm going to give you the last word tonight amongst the panelists. Any advice?
Jeff, it's a very difficult last word to say when my brilliant co-panelists have said everything brilliant I could think of. I was like, okay, I'm going to say this, and then Tom comes in and Young says, and then Tom, that's okay. This is a gap.
Nitesh, prove to the audience you're not a deep fake, okay?
Yeah, and then but I think and then what everyone else has said, right? And essentially, right, the way we are looking at. It's not just about technology, right? We have to think about people and processes. We have to think about, our confidence in what we are seeing. Let's not just believe it. We have to think about privacy. We have to think about integrity of our use of the system. And at the end of the day, there would be automation. It's not going away, right? It would be there. There are chores that will be done. And there are core work or higher order thinking that even Nick was alluding to. So how do we sort of balance this adoption of AI automation with the human brilliance, human insight? That it's an asset. It's part of my professional and personal toolkit. Things that I can allocate to this toolkit for efficiencies, and we have done that forever. Right? Reminder systems, calendaring systems, personally, right? And personal assistants came into play, right? So things that can help me be more efficient, the chores, so I can do something core. And the same thing applies to the professional world as well. How do I make my work processes more efficient by using this, and while adhering to the highest ethical standards I can in my use and deployment of these tools, and also having a sense of disclosure that this is how we used it, this is how we intend to use it, and this was AI output and versus how I sort of built on it. And one of the things that I believe, Tom, you mentioned was on prompt engineering. And that would be, again, to me, prompt engineering is simply thinking through the task more carefully, doing the chain of thought reasoning that's attached to it, and breaking down the instruction that you're giving to ChatGPT into pieces, and then sort of building it all together.
Thank you, Nitesh. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the conclusion of tonight's panel. Certainly want to thank our distinguished panel of experts who all shared their candid thoughts tonight. Gentlemen, this is certainly a fast-changing subject, so hopefully we can reconnect again in the future and give everyone an update on where we're at. For our audience, just a friendly reminder, Game Changers is brought to you by the Notre Dame Alumni Association and is powered by Irish Compass, the university's official professional online community for alumni and students to network, access mentors and coaches, find jobs, and much more. We invite our alumni and students to be active on irishcompass.nd.edu, where you go to tap into the Notre Dame network. The Game Changers series is found on Irish Compass and thinknd.edu, I believe YouTube as well, and we encourage everyone to check out our discussion on coding AI. Let me end tonight with two simple statements. God bless and go Irish. Have a good evening.
Go Irish.
Go Irish.